Michael, can you hear me?
I can indeed.
All righty. Well then, I would like to introduce you to the group. These are our law and literature students and some guests. And let me just say, Utopia 500 was always conceived of as an interdisciplinary project. You can't do an interdisciplinary project without engaging an historian, and I think we really hit the jackpot. I introduce to you Professor Michael H. Hoeflich, an author or editor of 15 books and more than 115 articles, many of them profound explorations of legal history. He is an historian and a legal historian par excellence, being a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, a member of the American Antiquarian Society, and the Kansas correspondent of the Selden Society, a learned society concerned with the study of English legal history. So you can't find, I think, a better fit for Utopia 500 than our current guest. He is also the John H. and John M. Kane Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of Kansas School of Law. He holds degrees from Haverford, from Cambridge University, that's that little place in England, right? Yes. And from Yale Law School. And in 2003, he was awarded an honorary Doctor of Laws degree by Baker University, the oldest university in Kansas. He's taught at various schools at University of Illinois. He was dean at Syracuse Law. He was dean at the University of Kansas from 94 to 2000. And he's also a columnist with the Lawrence Journal World. Michael, I want to welcome you virtually to our campus. And I will be sending you your very own, me and Tommy Moore, Utopia 500 t-shirt.
I will wear it with pride.
I'm glad to hear that, and with our greatest compliments. I turn it over to you. Thanks again.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me virtually. Welcome to 21st century legal education. For folks like me who is in a wheelchair, it's very nice to be able to do this, because last time I tried to fly, they left me in my wheelchair in a corridor for 40 minutes. They forgot me. So, at any rate, I'm going to talk to you for about 30 or 35 minutes about Thomas More and about American lawyers and authors in the period before the Civil War. And then please feel free when I'm finished to ask any questions you want, and I will try, if I can, to answer. Traditionally, legal historians tend to look to decided cases and to published legal treatises, you've all done it in the last few years, so that you can understand the development of legal doctrine. Inherent in that approach is the assumption, first of all, that there are going to be an adequate number of decided cases to find, as well as published treatises to provide sufficient material to write that history. Legal historians have, over the past several decades, gone beyond that approach and begun to look at other potential source materials, including notebooks, letters, diaries, annotated copies of books once owned by judges and lawyers. I've actually looked at things like eulogies and poetry and short stories appearing in popular magazines. Dan Hulsebosh at NYU has studied the annotated volumes of Chancellor James Kent's library. And Mary Sarah Bilder's studies of James Madison's annotated books have provided new and important insights into the founders' period, into the Constitution itself, and it's just, they're both superb works. As I say, my own work is focused on studying the history of law book publishing and distribution, and how lawyers read and wrote, and how they absorbed what they read and wrote. And that means looking at their libraries and library catalogs, etc. My method is rather straightforward. I study lawyers' library and auction catalogs from the period. I combine this with a study of book distribution and citation, and I attempt to understand the influence of particular books on period lawyers and judges. I supplement this with a study of public and institutional library catalogs that represent collections that lawyers and judges might have used. I try to read what they read, and I try not to remember what they couldn't have read. The method is far from perfect. For one thing, I spent my life in the pre-Civil War period. My wife is convinced that I'm one day going to forget how to turn on electric lights. I think she's probably right at my age. But there's also the pure fact read. It's sort of like when you buy books at the law school bookstore, it doesn't guarantee you're going to read them. Only a study of actual book annotations, such as done by Hoeflich or Builder, can provide certainty that a book was in fact read by the owner and annotator. Nevertheless, even within that limitation, I think a study of who owned, read, and cited particular books is worth attempting. And so when Professor Malloy wrote to me and asked me whether I'd give a paper relating to Thomas More in your symposium, I said, sure, it can be a chance for me to, for one thing, read again Utopia. I brought with me my own little 1808 edition, which I treasure, and here I am. So both Thomas More and Utopia have beguiled generations of readers. Thomas More, of course, as you know, is best known through the drama Man for All Seasons, but as compelling as that fictionalized More may be, the true Thomas More was even more so. He was the child of a successful lawyer. He attended Oxford for a brief period as a Cambridge man. I can understand why he would leave early. And then he moved on to Lincoln's Inn in London, where he was called to the bar in 1501. For almost 2 decades after his admission, More carried on a very successful law practice in both the common law courts and the Court of Chancery. I suppose you could say he was Tudor England's David Boies. He was also politically engaged and served in the Commons. He served as an under-sheriff in London, which was actually quite an important position, and he also served as a royal councillor beginning in 1518. He was knighted in 1521. More was also a man of great piety. He served as a young man in the household of Archbishop Robert Morton, and at that time he showed great interest in the monastic orders, leading some later historians to believe he was actually a covert monk. But he became Lord Chancellor of England in 1527, succeeding the disgraced Cardinal Wolsey. As Chancellor, ironically, he was responsible for signing the death warrants of several so-called Protestant heretics. But More's political and professional downfall came with the introduction of legislation sponsored by King Henry that required the swearing of an oath that King Henry was the, quote, supreme head of the Church of England. This More would not do out of piety and principle. So in 1532, he lost all of his offices. On July 1, he was indicted, and he was executed on July 6. Speedy justice, to say the least, if justice it was at all. Throughout his life as a lawyer, a politician, a courtier, More also was a man of letters. He was a friend of the great humanist Erasmus, whom he brought to England, and he corresponded with many of the humanistic scholars then active in Europe. Perhaps the most important fruit of More's humanism was his Utopia, first published at Leuven in 1516 in Latin, as all proper humanist works were. Indeed, the first English translation by one Ralph Robinson was published in 1551. Why so long? Simply you had to wait long enough to be safe, meaning not only had More to be dead, but so had Henry VIII. The second publication by Bishop, who was Bishop of Salisbury, and that was published in 1684, over 150 years later. Utopia, the book itself, is, in my opinion, I think, both eccentric and puzzling, and it's a work in the Platonic tradition as interpreted by the humanists. That a successful and politically ambitious would publish such is exceptional, very brave or very crazy. Indeed, the debate over whether Utopia is a serious work at all, or whether it should have been read and should satire, continues on to this day. The sides are split. I think that Utopia is a prime exemplar for analysis by deconstructionists. You've never heard the term, the text. They do response theory. And what they're basically saying is, and I agree in this case, to the extent that how one reads and understands Utopia very much depends upon what the reader brings to the text. If you think that a lawyer working, who would eventually work for Henry VIII and become Lord Chancellor of England, was conceivably able to write a book anti-monarchical legalist, you think if you think that that's crazy, then completely schizophrenic. More's Utopia had special meaning for the English colonists in North America, because many of those colonists believed that the location of the mythical Utopia was intended, in fact, to be there. And even were this not the case, many of those colonists were to some degree utopians, who'd fled England in the hopes of establishing a better world. Many of the early colonists sought to create religious utopias based on biblical models, which is certainly not what More had done. Others sought to create secular social institutions that would replace the hierarchical and aristocratic society they'd left. Whatever the subtle distinctions between the various types of utopian thought in the colonies, there's no doubt that More's utopia had great appeal to many of them. A Platonic text not exist in some Platonic dimension outside of our own. Rather, they exist in the real world, and to gain influence in the real world, they have to be communicated. Thus, the printing history of More's Utopia is critical, I think, to understanding the spread of the ideas contained in it. While Utopia was first printed on the continent in Latin, the majority of editions that have appeared in England have appeared in English translation. There were two major translations that were available to the American colonists before we became our own people. The first was, as I say, by the English humanist Richard Robinson. The second, printed over 100 years later, was by Bishop Burnet. That first Robinson edition was printed first in 1551 and then again in a revised edition in 1556, and then it was reprinted in 1597, 1624, and 1639. 5 separate printings in a very short while, less than a century. And it's what I can tell you as somebody who studies these things, that amount of reprinting indicates some degree of popularity. We're talking about that meaning having thousands of copies in print. To give you some contrast, a modern university press book, the normal first printing varies between 500 and 700 copies, and they're rarely reprinted. Even in Thomas Pope Glunt, in a Censura of Utopia, as I say, was published in 6 translation on errors in that Robinson first translation. Burnet's translation was reprinted multiple times, I mean, literally into the dozens. But neither translation of Utopia was reprinted in the North America. In fact, Utopia was never printed in the colonies in North America. On the other hand, there were fair numbers of copies of More's Utopia in the colonies. Why didn't colonial publishers reprint it then? Simply, I'll suggest, because there were lots of copies floating about with more than a dozen editions printed in England and Dublin and Glasgow. And there was a strong transatlantic, and oftentimes it was actually cheaper to get an imported book, particularly from Dublin, than it would have been to print it and buy it in the colonies themselves. Indeed, there were so many copies that Richard Beale Davis, in a book called The Colonial Southern Bookshelf, says that Utopia was, quote, found in dozens of Southern collections in 1800. And oftentimes there were multiple copies in major libraries. William Byrd of Westover, one of the greatest libraries, he was a Virginian, had, I think, 3 or 4 different copies and different editions of Utopia. But it wasn't just the books. Actually, one of Thomas More's own descendants played an important role in the founding and governance of the English colony in Maryland. I don't know if any of your speakers have talked about this yet. Father Henry More, Thomas's great-grandson, was a Jesuit, and indeed a Jesuit provincial, a very senior official. And according to Brad Johnson, who studied Henry More, Henry More was a close advisor to 2 generations of the Lords Baltimore, the founders of the Maryland colony. And it was a colony, of course, founded as a refuge for Catholics being oppressed in England. Since individual freedom, the freedom to choose how one worships and whom one worships, was essential in More's Utopia, it seems quite likely that More's great-grandson's advice to the Lord Baltimore included passages from Utopia. Brad Johnson studied the Utopia and the Maryland Act Concerning Religion of 1636, and his study makes a very conclusive argument that the language of that act derives directly from More's Utopia. So via his own great-grandson, Thomas More had a very, very significant role in the founding of Maryland. Now, from the legal historian's perspective, there are a number of aspects of More's Utopia, even aside from that notion of individual freedom to worship, that are quite interesting. More, for example, expresses strong opinions against the then prevalent wide-scale use of capital punishment for property crimes. Another issue that it discusses that's drawn great interest is the proper role of lawyers in the law, and of course his idea to be as simple as possible. There are simply no lawyers in the Utopia, and they're not needed because the law in Utopia is simple, unlike the complexity of the common law that More was indeed a master of. In Utopia, and I'm quoting now, they have few laws, and such is their constitution that they need not many. They very much condemn other nations whose laws, together with the commentaries on them, swell up so many and so dark as not to be read and understood by every one of the subjects. Since every citizen could read and understand the laws, laws were superfluous. They have no lawyers among them, he says, for they consider them as a sort of people whose profession it is to disguise matters and to wrest the laws, and therefore they think it is much better that every judge, as in other places the client trusted to a counselor, by this means they both cut off many delays and find out truth more certainly. More, of course, in this passage reflects the perpetual complaints that have appeared in popular literature throughout virtually the whole history of early modern and modern England and in the United States to the present. One of the Professor Malloy was nice enough to point out that I published all these books and articles, cigar boxes. So trust me, this is a perpetual theme, and I'm sure you have heard it. When I first started law school at Yale, the first day we had, I'm sure you had the equivalent, an introduction to the school. In my case, it was by Jeff Hazard, a great procedural specialist. And he got up and in his very typical way, I hope someday, if he's still alive, you might get to hear him if you can. He said, well, I don't have a lot to say. The only thing I'll say is that you have to remember that whenever you are adverse, no matter what the degree of adversity in a courtroom, when you get out, you have to be sure that you drop it and you stay civil to all of your brethren at the bar. And then he smiled and he said, because you will discover now that you've become law students and soon to be lawyers, no one except other lawyers will ever drink with you. Complaints of unnecessary legal complexity and obscurity to make the common law mystery put clients at the mercy of their lawyers and caused massive delays in the doing of justice, when justice was done at all. And again, that's a theme in popular literature. And let's not forget the joys of law French. As someone who had to learn that in graduate school, it is neither legal nor French. It is simply gobbledygook in many cases, a combination of historical accident and just plain nastiness by those who invented the language. The distrust of the lawyers and legal system was pervasive during the colonial period. Many of the colonists had fled England as a result of persecution under laws enacted by Parliament and implemented by the courts. Lawyers and judges were individuals who carried out legal oppression. The colonists wanted anything they could do to get away from not only the people who implemented those laws and the people who wrote those laws, but the laws themselves. Colonial laws tended to favor a legal system in which, quote, every man could be his own lawyer, and in which the profession of law and litigation to which it seemed to give rise was disfavored. In the Carolina Code, in the Carolina colony, the first law code stated, quote, it shall be a base and vile thing to plead for money or reward. So all of us are base and vile, according to the founders of South and North Carolina. In William Penn's colony in Pennsylvania, again, there were strong restrictions on legal fees. Penn believed that the best way to get rid of lawyers is not allow them to charge very much for their services. And so, basically, the colonies and the colonists were not very favorable to lawyers, and thus they were, in many cases, favorable to Utopia for many reasons. They didn't like lawyers. They wanted freedom of religion. They wanted to shut down the vast number of crimes that could be bring on a death sentence. I believe at one point in the late 18th century, 232 separate crimes in England carried the death penalty, including stealing a loaf of bread. And thus, it's kind of interesting to ask how the founders dealt with Utopia. Thomas Jefferson owned 2 copies. Being Thomas Jefferson, he not only had the English translation by Burnet in the Glasgow edition of 1743, he also actually owned, one of the few colonists to do so, the original Latin work, a 1550 version. Now, neither copy actually contains annotations, alas, but have Jefferson's initials. So we know he at least opened it up and put his initials on it. Jefferson also owned a copy of a volume called Political Classics that was published in London in 1794-95, and that included Algernon Sidney's Discourses on Government, Rousseau's Treatise on the Social Compact, which is certainly a quasi-utopian work, and Moore's Utopia in the Burnet translation. So really, he owned 3 separate copies. Now, I'm a great fan of John Adams, and not simply because of that terrific TV show. And so I'm always very, very interested in Adams's reading. Unfortunately, we don't have a good contemporary copy of Adams's library. We have a copy of his son's library, John Quincy Adams' library, that is contemporary to Quincy Adams. And there is actually a 20th century catalog of the books Adams gave to the Boston Public Library. And then if you ever get to Boston, you can go in there and you can actually ask to hold a book that John Adams owned, many of them with his notes in the margins. It's pretty damn cool to ask for his Federalist Papers, let me tell you. But although we don't have any record of Adams owning Utopia, as far as the library entry do, we do have this very interesting letter that Adams sent. He says in a letter in 1771, Kent brought with him Utopia, or the Happy Republic, a philosophical romance by Sir Thomas More. The translation, I think, is better than mine, which is by another hand. The romance is very elegant and ingenious, the fruit of a benevolent and candid heart, a learned and strong mind, the good humor, hospitality, humanity, and wisdom of the Utopians charming, the elegance and taste engaging. Their freedom from avarice and foppery and vanity is admirable. So he did indeed have a copy at one point, and I like to think that the reason why it didn't go to either his son Quincy or to the Boston Public is because maybe he just kept it with him and took it away, you know. It may well be there right now in heaven with him. In a 1785 letter to John Jay, who was then the U.S. Secretary of Foreign Affairs, again, he quoted from Utopia. Interestingly, he quoted it on whether or not the United States should develop its shipbuilding industry in order to strengthen ourselves against foreign enemies. And he quoted the Utopia as saying, as to their exportation, thought it better to manage that themselves than to let foreigners come and deal in it. In other words, let's build them ourselves rather than buy them abroad, because the people we buy them from today may be our enemies tomorrow. James Madison also was an admirer of More's Utopia. In 1783, he sent a list of books to the Library of Congress suggesting things they should purchase. It was a list divided in categories. One of the categories was headed politics and listed in importance. The first most important volume, there were 38 entries all told, was Plato's Republic. The second was Aristotle's Treatise on Government. And the third was none other than Thomas More's Utopia. Given the popularity of More's Utopia during the colonial period and among the founders, one would expect that its popularity would have continued into the early republic. And you would think that the book would have been reprinted in the United States. It was, in fact, reprinted, but only once, in 1834 in Boston by Hilliard Gray. Now, Hilliard Gray was the leading law book publisher of the time, so that is interesting in and of itself. It's also interesting, however, that the Utopia was not, in fact, published under the category of politics, nor under the category of law. It was published under the category of Old English romances, along with the history of Richard III. Now, the fact that this leading law publisher, because mostly they publish law books, would publish this in a series of literary reprints, may well be some indication that the publishers thought that this was really a book for antiquarians and for those who were studying literature, and not for those interested in politics or law. And indeed, it's not clear how successful they were in selling it. Even though I rarely come out of the 19th century and much prefer the 17th, I actually did something I have serious moral reservations about. I went to Google and used their ngram search algorithm, and I discovered that a search for Thomas More turns up 0 results for the antebellum years. A search for Utopia turned up a remarkably small percentage. In 1820, according to Google, the word utopia shows up in what they characterize as an awful lot of books, as 0.00000000618%. I don't even know how you actually say that in English. In 1840, it increased to 0.00000002609. In other words, it didn't show up much. So it suggests that the work was probably not all that popular, at least amongst most people. And that at least confirms the wisdom of American publishers' decision not to reprint it, because after all, publishers are not eleemosynary and educational foundations. They're in the business to make money. I might want to say, well, why would that happen? Why would it decline in popularity? Well, several things. First, while it was certainly not the most popular book in England, it was reprinted many, many times, even in the 19th century. My little copy I held up, here we go again, was a reprint by Thomas Frognall Dibdin in 1808 with a very long introduction and notes. And that itself was reprinted, and you can find it in virtually every major English library, both public and private, of the period, but of course not in the U.S. So if there was a serious decline in popularity, I think there were several reasons. First, remember, the American colonists were in fact English. They were English culturally, English legally, and English politically. Moore's Utopia, particularly in the Burnett Whiggish translation, was very much a book for English men and women dissatisfied with the then current state of English law, government, and society. It was a work that echoed the concerns of the progressive colonists who chafed under English political and legal regimes. For the founders, men and women, and yes, there were women founders, folks. Mercy Otis Warren was one of the more important ones, consumed with breaking away from England's sovereignty and establishing a new republic. The Utopia was a book of great interest, as were the ancient republics of Greece and Rome as sources of inspiration for the new republic. But once the revolution was concluded successfully, attention shifted. The new form of government and the legal system was now established and generally accepted, at least in its broad outlines. If anything, utopian movements, which I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, were seen as threats to the new republic. Furthermore, some aspects of Moore's utopian vision, like individual freedom to worship as one please, were already incorporated into the heart and soul of our government. Other aspects, such as universal education and criminal justice reform, also had strong proponents. But some of Moore's utopian ideas, such as the abolition of the legal profession, weren't so attractive to the citizens of the new nation. And so, indeed, when you think about popular dislike of the legal profession, I can't say that everyone disliked Moore's ideas about lawyers, but certainly the lawyers did. And indeed, I also have to say, Catholic bias against Catholics was very strong in the period before 1860 in the United States. And although not yet canonized by the church in the 19th century, Moore was remembered as a Catholic martyr, and he was also remembered, and I won't go into all the citations, but he was oftentimes cited by Protestant American writers as the man who burned good Protestants during the early years of Henry's monarchy. So while the audience for Moore's Utopia might have declined after the Revolution and before the Civil War, it didn't lose all favor either with lawyers or the general republic. For instance, in the 1836 catalog of the American Antiquarian Society, America's oldest scholarly society, shows that the society owned a copy of the 1743 Glasgow edition. The 1837 catalog of the Loganian Library in Philadelphia showed they also owned that edition of Utopia. The 1870 catalog of John Rice's library, it's a post-mortem catalog. His stuff was auctioned, so it was really primarily pre-Civil War, included a copy of the 1808 London edition of Dibdin's book. James Wynne in 1860 published a book on various libraries, private libraries in New York, and he highlights that George M. Strong, a wealthy merchant, owned not simply a copy of Moore's complete works, but he owned the folio 1557 edition that, according to Wynne, was both rare and expensive. The Boston Athenaeum Library, the library to which all of the great jurists of the Boston Antebellum legal set, including Story, etc., owned a copy of Moore's work that was listed in its 1827 catalog. And to my mind, even more interesting, several mercantile library catalogs of the period, Boston and New York, list copies of Utopia. Why I think that's particularly interesting is mercantile libraries were established in the periods between the Revolution and about 1870. Then they were established to educate young men coming into the cities to become clerks. Young men who are going to be clerks in law offices, young men who are going to be clerks in counting houses, in industry, in retail. They were very, very worried. Society was worried generally that these young men would become dissolute and they would go into gambling and get drunk all the time and smoke tobacco. And the idea was to establish these mercantile libraries, which were free or very, very low cost to the young men, and then the young men would go and they would read good things. And that would help them become pious and successful merchants and lawyers and business people. And the fact that Utopia is a common work found in these libraries indicates that it was seen, at least by the library directors, that it was could be a good influence, and I'll leave it to that. There's also decent evidence that even in the popular realm, the Utopia was certainly recognized as a worthy book. William Hinckley Prescott, one of America's first great historians, praised Moore in an 1842 article in the North American Review, which was then probably, I don't know, we don't have an equivalent anymore, I guess the New Yorker of the day. Prescott said, "God has not often combined charity with enthusiasm. When he has done so, he has produced his most notable work, a Moore or a Fenelon." Samuel Lorenzo Knapp, one of the preeminent biographers and literary critics of the antebellum period, wrote a book called Advice in the Pursuits of Literature. It's published in 1841, and it was aimed at those clerks, the people who wanted to make their way into the upper echelons of society and business. In that book, Knapp says, "Sir Thomas More, the author of the Utopia, was one of the very great men of that age. He was educated in the best manner of the times. He was a man of first-rate talents and was called to discharge many high and important duties as a public functionary. He was undoubtedly preeminent among the great scholars of his time. It is well for the world when such men as Sir Thomas More are found to direct and in a measure fix the taste of an age." Francis Lieber, German emigre scholar, wrote a number of important books, close friend of Joseph Story. At the request of President Lincoln, he was the author of General Orders 100 of 1863, which is the background of all modern law of armed conflict and the Geneva Conventions, and became one of the first professors at Columbia Law School under Theodore Dwight. He wrote about More's Utopia in his Political Ethics that was first published in 1838. He said, "Many questions of the highest importance to the citizen are discussed in a spirit far in advance of his time. He recommended as early as under Henry VIII perfect freedom of conscience, which was a thing absolutely unknown then and for centuries afterward." And of course, ironically, More championed freedom of conscience just a few years before he had his head chopped off because he was a pious Catholic unwilling to abandon his church. Utopians. We had at least three major utopian movements in the United States. Owen founded a community called New Harmony in Indiana. He said that his community was founded upon the principle commended by Plato, Lord Bacon, and Sir Thomas More, as well as himself. A.T.M. Cabet, who founded a utopian community called Icaria in Louisiana, studied More's Utopia at the British Museum while he was waiting for the boat to take him over to the U.S. to found his community. So not just Lenin, not just Marx, but also Cabet and Sir Thomas More. Many lawyers and judges had copies of the Utopia in their libraries. I won't go into long detail, but I will tell you that many of the leading lawyers of the antebellum period did, not all. James Kent, as far as I know, did not. Story, as far as I know, did not. But of course, they both had university libraries, so they didn't necessarily have to buy those. But it was certainly a popular book amongst many. Those who did own, amongst those who did, Rufus Choate. His contemporaries thought that he was one of the two greatest lawyers, litigators of the age. Choate and Webster went hand in hand. I don't know if Professor Malloy has mentioned this to you, but when Choate or Webster would be known to be litigating a case, people would travel over 100 miles to come and see it. Webster actually had advance men. He left in his letters to his advance men where a week or two before he was to appear at a small courthouse, he would have people go out and put up posters saying Daniel Webster will be arguing the case so-and-so in this courthouse on Friday next. Choate was a rock star. He was also a distinguished scholar, and he owned a copy of the London 1838 edition of Utopia. John Pickering, a Massachusetts lawyer, politician, owned a copy of the 1834 American edition of Utopia. One of the great Boston judges of the period, John Davis, owned a 1684 London edition, and so on, and so on, and so on. Utopia was at least well enough known to be the subject of a satire. A man named Ezekiel Sanford published in 1828 a book called The Humors of Utopia, spelled E-U-T-O-P-I-A. Obviously, I'm being totally anecdotal because that's how you have to do this stuff. We don't have the kind of databases. Certainly, based on my anecdotal research, as I say, Utopia, while it may not have been a bestseller at the time, it was known and it was influential throughout the colonies, throughout the Revolutionary period, and throughout the Antebellum period. How much was it really loved and honored? Well, obviously, it was only published once in the U.S. in that period. But, you know, I have spent the last 30-some years going through library catalogs. I've read at least 400 or 500 of them. And, you know, I would say that until Professor Malloy asked me about Utopia, I hadn't really noticed it. On the other hand, a book called Gil Blas of Saint-Étienne by Alain-René Lesage, I can't recall a lawyer's library catalog that didn't have a copy. So what can I say? He was not a Harold Robbins, but Moore was certainly at least known. Finally, let me just finish up by saying that do citations to Moore's Utopia show up actually in court decisions? And the answer is almost never. There is a case that was decided in 1832 in the Court of Chancery of New Jersey over the ownership of property in an educational fund that had been established by Quakers. And by the way, you won't find this in Lexis or Westlaw. I found it in a pamphlet. It was never reported. It was a debate about who owned some property. There was a break in the plaintiffs and defendants in terms of whether or not they ascribed themselves to certain principles of Quakerism. And counsel for the plaintiffs, a man named George Wood, in a very learned argument citing Edmund Burke, Kent's commentaries, early English chancery cases, also quoted Thomas More. He said, even the early reformers who are anxious for liberty of thought were for stopping short at the point of which their ideas of reformation in religious doctrine and discipline carried them. Philosophers in those times often dreamt of a greater latitude of sentiment and action, but they were only the daydreams of philosophical speculation. Sir Thomas More, in his Utopia, was for allowing the utmost breadth of religious freedom. He departed very essentially from these principles, and goes on to talk about how he killed off Protestants. Last cite I will give you, Robert Rantoul. He was a lawyer, he was a congressman, he was a law pupil of John Pickering, and he was an opponent of the common law. He wanted to replace the common law with a code. He was one of the earliest and most powerful of the pro-codification movement. He was also a proponent of limiting capital punishment. He was an early criminal law reformer. And he, too, in a speech, cites Thomas More. He says, the celebrated Thomas More, Chancellor of England more than 300 years ago, expressed a decided opinion against the punishment of death for crimes against property. That He then, the next year, that was in 1836, he sat on a commission appointed by the Massachusetts House of Representatives. It was composed of himself, Jerome Van Crowninshield Smith, and Thomas Whitmore. The official report presented to the legislature says, quote, "God has commanded us not to kill," says Sir Thomas More, "and shall we kill so easily for a little money? Yes, answers the law of Massachusetts, regarding the smallest coin in the rich man's purse as more sacred than his person." So More lived on through the Civil War as an inspiration for progressive thought in freedom of religion, in criminal reform, in codification and legal simplification. And indeed, he lives on today in the same way. Open for questions.
Who would like to start? You have a question? Yes, please.
So how does the open-endedness of the book affect how people implement?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. You're going to have to speak a bit louder.
Sorry, you have to go to the mic.
Yeah, why don't you go to the mic?
Be brave.
So the open-endedness of the book Utopia, how does that affect the implementation of it?
Oh, I mean, I don't think the open-endedness affects its ability to influence people, except in a very strange way. Because I think the open-endedness of the book actually led to something that I didn't talk about orally, though will be in the written version, which is it was most frequently categorized in libraries as a work of fiction, oftentimes actually as romance. And basically, people were told in the period before the Civil War not to read fiction, or I should say men were told not to read fiction, because fiction was seen to be trivializing and could also lead to dissolution. And therefore, the fact that it was characterized as a novel actually hurt its distribution and hurt it in getting a reading public. Indeed, David Hoffman, who was the founder of the University of Maryland Law School, published a book called The Course of Legal Studies, which became the basis for Harvard Law School's curriculum in this period. And Hoffman also said, don't read novels. Yeah, it's really a rather funny passage. I can quote it sort of inaccurately. He basically says, don't read fiction. Instead, what you should do is go out for long walks, and as you see signs, study the etymology of the words and names on the signs. So instead of reading something fun, go out there and then try to puzzle out where that name on the street sign came from. And in terms of women reading it, it was considered to be far too daring and progressive, since as you know, it gives far more rights to women than the contemporaries did. So the open-endedness was part and parcel of the structure, if I can put it that way. And I think in that sense, it led it to be characterized as fiction, whereas works by people like Edmund Burke or even Plato were always classified as politics or philosophy. And you know, I mentioned Madison thought More's book was politics, but most actually categorized it the way that Hilliard Gray did, which is as literary fiction. So that it hurt it that way. Does that help?
Yes, yes, it does.
Anyone else? Anyone?
I don't know.
You have to speak up.
Sorry. The freedom of religion in Utopia, I kind of interpreted it as they didn't really value religion. And I was wondering how people use the freedom of religion in Utopia to kind of guide their policies.
I disagree with that. I don't think that was the way More intended it. I mean, there is certainly the humanist element in there, but More was, I mean, from early on in his life. I mean, he grew up as a member of the household of Robert Morton, and so he grew up in a powerful bishop's household. He dressed like a monk, which led some of his contemporaries to think he was actually a monk in secret. And obviously, he sacrificed his life for his Catholic faith. And so I think, you know, it's not, maybe this is, again, reader response stuff. I mean, but when I come to it and I read it, I don't see the freedom of religion issue as one where he is trying to say religion's not important. I think what he's trying to do is disentangle religion from the state. You know, he is a man of his time, and indeed, as I say, ironically, not very long after it's published, he's signing death warrants for Protestants, and then he himself soon is the victim of such a thing. You can't have freedom of religion when you have an established religion, and I think that More's Utopia would have been, I think, very, very attractive to a number of those who favored. I don't like to talk about separation of church and state because I think that's very Jeffersonian, but not what, say, John Adams thought. People forget that the state of Massachusetts did not disestablish the Christian religion until 1832. I mean, Massachusetts was a Christian state constitutionally until 1832. John Adams grew up there. I think what we have to understand is that there's a difference between saying there is a freedom to worship as you will and saying there is a separation of church and state. And I think what More is saying is that there's a freedom to worship as you will, which means that there is not an established religion. But I don't think he sees that as a derogation of religion. I think he sees it as a derogation of state power to control religion. And I think that was a much more attractive version of sort of individual freedom of conscience to most of the northern, at least, founders. And I mean, that's how they would have read it. I mean, you're reading, I mean, it's a fair reading, but you're reading it as the Jeffersonian, whether wittingly or unwittingly, i.e. deist.
Well, that explains a lot. I always suspected that she was a deist.
Nothing wrong with it. Nothing wrong. I love Jefferson.
Not that there's anything. Any other questions? Michael, there's a question I wanted to ask you because, as you said at the beginning, in one sense, this book is one continuing puzzle, and maybe it's intended to be one. I don't know if you recall, we did a public viewing of the film of A Man for All Seasons a few weeks ago, and I was reminded on seeing it after so many years that there's actually sort of a hint, an indirect reference to Utopia at the very beginning. In the background, when More receives that initial summons, in the background, his guests are laughing it up about some little inside joke about Utopia, and then that's the last you hear about it. But there is a tension to Utopia, and I wonder, how do we explain, as you mentioned, this preeminent establishment lawyer telling us that there they have very few laws, and yet in colonial America and early republic, it's these preeminent lawyers who are sort of the champions or sponsors of it. I mean, Jefferson, Madison, Adams, with all their disparate views, they all seem to have some affinity for Utopia.
Well, I'll say two things. I was lucky enough to be a student of, and then a colleague of Jeffrey Eldon's, the great Tudor historian. And I've always taken to heart one of the things that Jeffrey felt very strongly about, and that is one has to understand that in Tudor England, to speak one's mind was about as dangerous a thing as one could do. And secondly, which was Jeffrey's observation, having lived through Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini, and Churchill, as he would put it, was to say that when one lives under a dictatorship and one cannot speak one's mind directly, one speaks it in comedy and satire and caricature, covertly. And if you think about, this may be a strange parallel to you, but think about Cabaret, the film.
I was thinking when you said that.
And think about how people had to disguise what they were saying. Think about novels written under Stalinist rule in Russia. Think about what's going on now in China. What's going on now? I was just listening recently to a woman who's an Egyptian stand-up, the first woman Egyptian stand-up comedian. And she said, that's the only way I can say important things. And it's not until it's long past the tyrannical regime that one can then deconstruct the text, go past the satire, and see that there is a core of reality. You know, I mean, when you think about Tudor England, we talk about Kit Marlowe's secret life under Elizabeth as a spy, all the debates, who really wrote Shakespeare. I mean, the Tudors loved puzzles. Go look at the Tudor roses, symbolism. I mean, everything has layers and layers and layers of meaning. I remember one of my teachers when I was studying Shakespeare used to talk about the Shakespearean removes. You'd have to get to the 4th or 5th level before you actually got to what he was saying. I think you have to understand Utopia just that way. And then when you come back to the United States, the colonists, they're still Tudors. They really are. They're just revolutionary Tudors. But it's Tudor England put on North American shores. It's not till we get to the latter part of the 18th century and we've got this new Enlightenment where people like Jefferson, Adams, Madison can pick and choose. They cherry pick lots of books, not just Utopia. So they can ignore the stuff about lawyers if they want, but they can focus on things like freedom of religion. Where a Tudor reading it, if he wanted to keep his head, would have said, oh, what a wonderful satire. Nobody would ever think that was possible or right. So, I think that's the thing about text, which, they all do have multiple layers. And I think not just coming from the reader, I think authors, and Moore was a brilliant stylist. The style of that book is quite convoluted, although it appears simple. Oftentimes the most convoluted books are the simplest because that's how you hide most complex and revolutionary ideas. Look at the Declaration of Independence.
So it may not be so much a question of deconstructing it as decoding it.
Exactly, or reconstructing it.
Okay.
I think the thing that I like most about that play is in fact that aspect of A Man for All Seasons, because you could also say it is a book for all seasons.
Well, I think that's one of the things we've been discovering over the course of this seminar, that it continues to resonate. And ironically enough, from what you've told us of the trail through early American history, it seems to resonate perhaps even more strongly and more broadly today.
Oh, I think it does. Again, I did carry the engram up, and while utopia hardly ever appears as a term in the pre-Civil War period, when you get to the Gilded Age, the 1870s and forward, it just spikes. And again, because it's a protest book. And I would go so far as to say is that if the American public were literate enough to want to read, which I have my doubts about, it would be a very popular book again today because it really does resonate again. I've been listening, as I guess everybody has, to what's going on with the Mr. Trump, and the same kind of issues are coming up again, except he's not very subtle about it.
No.
But these are perennial issues, and they will continue to be.
Well, this dovetails nicely with the first paper, my paper, which actually does an empirical analysis of use of the term in popular journalism. It's so embedded in our thinking, particularly about politics, that no journalist I came across ever feels that they have to explain what they mean by the term. It's just, of course, you understand.
Sure. I mean, I have to say, I've been really surprised that nobody in the debate on what does separation of church and state mean has actually gone back to Utopia and looked at that, because it is in some ways a middle ground that might actually provide a basis for a workable compromise.
Well, it may be that they're not looking for middle ground.
That may be.
Well, any further questions? Michael, I want to thank you. This has been not only extremely enlightening, but very entertaining. And I'm looking forward to reading the full version of the text.
Well, thank you all for indulging me. Chris Gimroff told me you're viewing me on a large screen. I find that a horrifying idea. So I apologize to you for that, having to suffer through that. Have a wonderful night.
21st century.
You got it.
Thanks again.
All right. Bye-bye. Thanks, folks. Have a great one.
How do I? What? Oh, and then you're Thank you very, very much. Okay.
So we're still recording.
Oh, we are? Okay. Well, then I guess we can't leave. We'll just have to go. Well, we'll find some way to end it. But I think for present purposes, we're over. I did send out an email just to remind you that we have class, at the top of the hour next week for our discussion of 1984. So that takes us back a few years. And then the week after that, the 21st, which is our last meeting, it'll be 2:30 again, and that will be the presentation by Susan Herman, president of the ACLU. My understanding is the school is going to have other related events that she wants to participate in terms of meeting student groups and so forth, but we are at the heart of her visit. So we'll talk to you again next week. Thank you very much.